email about that weird graph on page 27.
Yeah.
It's great. You get a lot of good conversation, and yeah, I think it can be really helpful.
Welcome to Reproducibility, an open science podcast featuring early career researchers. I'm Sarah, coming to you from Lincoln in the UK, where I'm an immigrant on the land of the people who colonized the land that I've called home most of my life, but called Canada. Today, I'm super excited to welcome a guest, Nora Serres, to Reproducibility. Nora, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm Nora, and a recent master's graduate from the University of Oslo in developmental psychology. And I'll actually be starting my PhD in the fall at the Ritmo Center at the University of Oslo as well, which I'm very excited for.
Yeah, that's super cool. As a music scientist, I actually know the Ritmo Center pretty well. So that's an awesome connection.
Nice. Cool.
So this episode, we are talking about Bayesian statistics and registered reports. So let's get started with our appetizer, which this week is brought to us by Nora.
Yeah, so this week I actually pulled a paper on Bayesian statistics, which, as we'll talk about later in the podcast, I've gotten quite into throughout my master's thesis and writing my registered report. And I really like this paper. It's quite consolidates kind of the basics of Bayesian statistics and also makes it digestible for us as well. And I think one thing that it does a good job of explaining is this idea of a sequential design with a maximal number of participants. And for all of us who have done research with people or requiring time or resources intensive data collection, it's a way to set up your design so that your evidence or the data that you collect goes towards this growing or Bayesian factor or Bayes factor that you move toward. And the sequential design essentially means that you are adding a participant. And as you are adding a participant, your data is being updated, or your final Bayes factor. So you're kind of putting them in the pool towards more likely for the H1 or the null. And you're kind of, amassing evidence as you go. And I thought it was a great explanation for this. So if you are hesitant about Bayes, this is a great first step.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a new term to me, this idea of sequential Bayes factor. And my initial reaction as someone who typically uses frequentist stats is this like, you can't always do one, you can't just add one participant until you get to where you want to go. But it's just a whole different framework, right? So it means something completely different.
Totally,
and in
yeah.
the Bayesian framework, you can do that. Whereas in frequentist, that's just like the biggest no-no. Or
exactly.
Not the biggest, but one of the big no-nos.
Exactly. And I think that's something where you kind of get stuck up on. It's like, well, yeah, exactly. Like you said, kind of, well, should I really just add participants until I get the number that I want? But kind of as we've been talking about a bit before this as well, is that you also have to get rid of your vocabulary of significance or insignificance. So you're not really adding until you get to a significant level, but you're getting to a level of, enough evidence to call it likely, essentially, no matter what, because you could go get enough evidence that it's most likely not the case or a part of the null. So, but I totally agree with you. It's kind of against every sort of 0.05 we've ever been
everything we've taught since like undergrad psychology. But anyways, that was a lovely snack to begin with. We will talk more about Bayesian later, but for now, let's move on to filling up on sandwiches.
Perfect.
So for this week's main course, we are discussing Nora's experience of doing a registered report for her master's thesis.
Yeah.
So do you want to, we'll start with that. What was your project? And tell us a little bit about your experience of doing that.
Awesome. Yeah. So as Sarah just mentioned, I wrote my master's thesis as a registered report, thanks to my fabulous and ambitious advisors who encouraged me that it wasn't too big of a task to take on. And I'm really happy that I did. And so so I guess to start, my paper that I wrote, or that I've submitted as the stage 1 acceptance, was The Role of Dialect Variability on Mispronunciation Sensitivity, an insight to infants' early language development from a Norwegian context by myself, Julian Mayer, and Natalia Kartashina. And so essentially what we have looked at was actually dialectal variability. And this is something that is really prevalent in Norwegian society today, is this native dialectal variation. And what we focused on was mispronunciation sensitivity around 13 months of age. So to this point, there's been essentially no research done kind of below around the 2-year age, or 20 months, looking at this native dialectal variation. And what we used was the intermodal preferential looking design. So showing 2 pictures side by side and naming one of the 2 items, and either the items were either correctly pronounced or mispronounced. And we analyzed the looking behavior, both pre and post naming, to this, to see if infants essentially accepted the mispronunciation as a correct. So to give kind of a little bit of an example from Norwegian, like the word for not is both ikke, inte, or itte. And you can use any of these. And there's also some dialectal words where, for example, the word to think, or I think, is jeg tror, or you can say jeg tror, like o or u. But if you switch this with mor and mur, it is the difference between mother and wall. So you've got this like medial vowel, and in one instance, it's totally acceptable and it's totally normal to just switch it out. And in other cases, it's not at all. Or switching out a K for a V, like kuffel, vuffel for Y. This is totally normal. And it's quite interesting that, Norwegians are quite flexible. And we're kind of looking at this young age, how flexible is this, or have they learned how to separate out? So we used familiar words and did the IPL task and tested 99. We ended up with our Bayesian statistics participants, which, monodialectal and bidialectal, which is quite interesting. So essentially for my project, I started it's a 2 years master's at the University of Oslo. And for the first year, they kind of set it up to start thinking about your thesis, and have the second year geared towards working on the thesis. But I kind of approached my advisors early, and they mentioned this registered report would be something that I could consider. And for me, this was really appealing. I like the idea of the challenge, but I also think that being able to write something that I could contribute to the field, which was really an exciting opportunity. And also, I think I got to dive headfirst into what open science is, what registered reports are, how to choose reviewers. This is like a big process. Or I don't have an org ID. How do I submit a paper? So it was quite a challenge, but I think I really appreciated this process of I guess when I'm setting up a project, you're really thinking through really thoroughly with the methodology, and even from the statistical pipeline, and what are you actually looking for, and when you are deciding what data to gather, what is actually going to be important to answer the questions you're asking. So I thought that this the experience, it was quite a whirlwind. I also did my thesis, or I wrote my thesis and went through my master's program during the pandemic, and so it had its own challenges, and also I guess the amount of connection, but it really lowered the threshold for asking questions. I ended up sending cold emails to quite a lot of the authors of papers that I read, to just ask them, because I was unfamiliar with either the way that they went about it, or the analysis, or how they got to certain numbers, how they decided that enough participants was enough. This was before I dipped into Bayesian statistics, but I think just kind of going forward and trying. And I think if anybody else is considering going for a registered report, I think it's totally worth it, just for, it kind of gets you into the mindset of why you're going about this research, but also how you're going about the research. I think it's really important. And you can't afford to think about what your results will be, because you have to get to this stage 1 first. And so you are setting up your experiment with the method in mind and not the outcome. And I think that this is something that really helped me, because in the end, I didn't get the same results that I expected. Like I got a null result. Like my monodialectal participants don't show mispronunciation sensitivity, and I did not expect this at all. Even when we got to the max amount of participants, but like, to me, this is peanuts of my paper. I don't care that I have a quote unquote a null, because I think I'm more confident in how I went about testing them, and I think this is something that could be really helpful.
And like, that's the evidence, right? Like you set it up in such a way that you could be quite confident in the result. And that's almost, I don't know, I feel like, I want to say isn't that what science is about? Like, we set it up to test a question and we're looking for an answer, but ideally we're not looking for the answer that we want to find, though we know that that's what a lot of the current incentives push us to do. I think it's a lot more interesting to ask a question and be like, okay, what's the best way for me to gather evidence for this?
Exactly.
And that's what we focus on.
Yeah.
And then just like see what happens.
Yeah. So I really found that was helpful. And I think also for doing a master's, and now I'll be starting PhD, so that also has a timeline and kind of a deadline for when you need to get papers done. And you have to choose kind of where you can afford to be picky and where you really want to spend your time finessing the approach. And it's I think that really helped as well, because you're focused on where you can make a strong framework and not necessarily how you can fiddle around on R until you get something that looks presentable.
Yeah.
So we all like colors and color packages, and something that makes you look like your line on your graph is a bit more sloped. But no, I think it's really, I felt it was really a valuable experience.
Awesome. My biggest worry with the registered report is timeline. I'm sure you've come across this before. So can you speak maybe a little bit about how you manage that? Because it's same with like any kind of other paper, you don't know how long it's going to take for the review to go through. And if there's multiple rounds, like, how do you navigate that within the confines of a program that has a deadline? Yeah,
absolutely. I will say I still get a little bit stressed thinking about it, because I ended up, as I mentioned, you kind of have the second year of your master's to do your thesis, and I ended up writing the stage 1 report, and I submitted it I submitted the stage 1 report June, so kind of before the summer break, before my second year. Right. And I didn't receive it back until late August, early September. And then it was kind of like, okay, well, this is expected. We're going to get it back and then review. But we got major revisions. And it was like, I went from using pupillometry to intermodal preferential looking design, because I was introducing too many new elements. And I think, like, looking back on it, it was really great, because the reviewers kind of had me narrow down how many new elements you're adding, and this is really important. But I guess all of the reviews and the revisions and the edits, I actually didn't get the last acceptance, final acceptance, before the end of February of my second year of my master's. And I had like flyers and QR codes for gathering data, and I'm gathering data with 13-month-old participants, and it's like a 10-day window for these kids to come in. And so it was quite stressful, but at the same time, I had spent so much time preparing for it that it was just kind of like all systems go. And I ended up testing a lot of participants between March and mid-April, essentially. And I had almost everything written up other than my kind of like plotting in where the results were to go, and then kind of some bullet points of, okay, well, if it went this way, this is what I would consider. If it went this way, and But yeah, it's quite stressful, but I think, again, having thought through so much, like you're almost considering elements of a discussion when you are writing a registered report, because you have all of these considerations to take in mind. And there are things that I would, change, or what I would look more closely in next time, as are with all studies. But I think it was a crunch of a timeline, but it also helped you evaluate, like, what's the important part of the paper? Is it is it the reasoning for why we need this and how you're going to go about it, or is it the actual numbers? And those are quite small, actually. And yeah, I spent a lot of time writing the script ahead of time, so this is something I think that's really important as well. And I made dummy data, and so this was also really helpful, because you can use this in the time when you're waiting for your report, unless they tear apart your statistical modeling. But I think, like, this is also something where it's like, R can be really time consuming if you want it to be. And I think, like, you learning to use dummy data is something that really helped as well, because you can kind of like model how potential participants could look.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the part of what you said was like super relatable. Like my master's thesis had way too many variables, and I like did not have enough to test that, so it was just like kind of a complete flop. Because I was like, wait, and no one told me. Like, I wish someone had told me.
Yeah.
So, like, you can't test all of these things with all of these different levels. It's just, you're not going to have the power.
Yeah.
But it didn't, I learned from it.
Yeah.
I sort of wish that I'd been told beforehand. But at the same time, in the UK, a master's is 1 year. So that really, really constrains the timeline. Because I've thought about it, like, how do I incorporate open science with the students that I'm going to start supervising?
Yeah.
And to me, so far, the only thing that I'm pretty sure I want to do is pre-registration, because I think, to me, like, that's sort of the lowest bar, because you're applying for ethics anyway, so you might as well just do a pre-registration.
Yep.
But it would be cool to try a registered report. I don't know. So I've tried one once, and it never happened, because there was a request for pilot data, right, as part of the submission.
Yes.
So I tried to pilot the study, and we're trying to figure out the method, what we're going to do. And we tried like 5 different things. Yeah. And in the end, it still like didn't do what we wanted. So it just sort of like died because we couldn't figure out how to actually test what we wanted to test. So it never got submitted. Yeah. So that was my first experience with registered reports, and it's not that I don't want to do it again. I absolutely plan to do one again. Which is, this particular one was a bit disappointing, and I guess it does question the timeline, because if you have to have pilot data as part of the registered report, that does require a bit of front-loading work.
Actually.
You didn't? Okay.
But it was for stage 1.
Yeah, this was stage 1.
Oh.
I guess it depends on journals. And it might have been a request that I sort of read as, it's better if we do it, so let's do it.
Yeah.
And it was good, because then I could walk through a bunch of things, and you have to realize that this wasn't actually going to pan out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think
it was a good process.
That's what you're saying is, like, it's good because it kind of makes you consider all of these parameters, but like you're saying, it is quite rigorous. And I think that this is also something that is really something to consider, is like, it is time intensive. So you can't just pretend that it's not, or you can't assume like, well, maybe it is, but I could just not rush through it. But I think I've got enough evidence. I think you really, and for me, I feel like it was kind of blissful ignorance, because this is the only paper I've ever submitted and written a registered report. And this is kind of my experience now with publication, is doing a registered report.
I think that's pretty good, actually.
Yeah. So, but I feel like it's blissful ignorance, because it's like, it was quite a lot of work. And I was just thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm going to do 3 of these for my PhD. And that's not necessarily the case for most people. But yeah, so I think it is, in a way, maybe it's good, but it's also, considering the timeline, it can be. But there is a type of registered report, I think, where you can get it kind of rushed, where you can apply for a it's something that is within a time constraint. You can apply for it for a stage 1 with a time constraint. So I'll have to look more into that.
Yeah. I might suggest it to my students then. We'll see. And I mean, I actually just remembered we've just been matched with our undergrad students who also have a year. But I say now is May. I don't know when it's going to be published. So now is May for us, for recording time. And so, we could, if anyone wants to, start now. And have like the summer to submit something. And then move on to next year.
Yeah. That's essentially what I did, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is becoming like more possible as we talk through it. I'm like, how can we possibly do this?
Well, and it's like, you never know, but I guess I was one of those students as well where they were like, well, you could in your free time work on a registered report in the summer, work on your edits in the summer. And I'm like, perfect. That sounds great. I'd love to, I'd love to hit the ground running. So I don't know how many there are out there who would say yes to that. But I think like opening it up, I think as somebody who's just starting, it's kind of tough to know how to take the first step. And I think for a lot of people, at least those who I've talked to, it's like, well, they've had a professor who has let them contribute in the discussion, and that's kind of how they've gotten an authorship on a first paper or something, or first contribution, or kind of been a part of this, the writing up or being a part of a paper. And so I think knowing that there's more than one way to get into it, that first paper, I think then it seems a little less daunting as well.
That's part of what I love about, from the point of view of a now supervisor, is that I would love if like these students' first experience of doing science was to do a registered report. Like you're like, that's all you know. You don't have to like unlearn a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
This is the standard, and it seems to have really benefited you. You also talked earlier about how helpful the framework was. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I would say when you're using kind of a stage 1 submission for the registered report, this framework where you have to, I guess their framework is where you develop the idea and you design the study, and then you have to go through the stage 1, the peer review, and then you're collecting and analyzing the data. But with this design study, they require that you have outlined an argument for why this research is needed or why it's important. But then you also have to outline how you will go about it, what kind of data you were actually planning on collecting it, and what it's going to be used for. So they kind of require that every kind of thread that you're putting out there in terms of data collection, but also what questions you're asking, it has to be followed up. Like the string has to be tied with some sort of outcome or some sort of analysis. And I think that this was really helpful because you are operating within this framework that requires you to consider where you'll be using all of these parts, and also what's feasible, and also what's required to learn to get there when you're looking at statistics. And I think understanding, I think early, especially during my bachelor's degree, where it was like, you can use ANOVA, you can, like you're getting all of these different statistical tests, and you're kind of learning what they are based on what they're going to give you as an outcome, but you don't necessarily take the time to learn like how you're planning out, how you're collecting the start points, and why that's important, how you tie it together to the outcome. So I think this was really important and helpful for me too, is like, okay, well, if I'm collecting some sort of data on for example the different dialects, like how am I going about that, and how am I asking, because I'm going to be using it to analyze these kind of groups and these clusters. And that was helpful. And also to be able, I think one thing that I also was thinking about is looking at other academic papers for people who have written in the same similar field on how they've kind of structured it as well. So you have a lot of different structures that you can be inspired by, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I guess it might help make it a little bit less daunting. And I don't know, it feels, as you're talking through it, feels to me like it really forces you to deeply understand what you're doing. Not to say that we generally like mindlessly repeat repeat things, but like I've certainly been guilty in the past of being like, oh, that's a cool paper. They did a cool thing. Let me just do it too.
Yeah.
Without like really deeply understanding why.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel it was a really good experience as well, and especially for learning what it's all about. I think, yeah, open science as well. This was also something where I was like, okay, well, if you're going to write something that is going to be quote unquote good enough or clear enough, I guess I should say, for other people to understand and for other people to use, like, this is also another step where it's not just you presenting your work, but it's also how would somebody else use what you are doing right now too. And I think that is something where maybe it's not as easy to consider, like how the next person will use what you are outlining, like how easy is that. So
yeah, I feel like it's hard to know, because I always think I'm giving enough information for somebody else, but then there's so many times where I'll read other people's papers, I'm like, there's missing information, why didn't they include this? And like I probably don't either, because it's not really convention in some cases, and it's hard with that amount of detail. But I guess that comes with, if you share your procedures, if you share your code, then those sorts of things become a little bit less of a concern. Like, still be as clear as you can, obviously, in the paper.
Yeah.
But if you have access to all the materials, then it helps a lot.
Yeah.
With being transparent and with facilitating applications.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, it's a really great point you bring up, and that is just like seamlessly, transitions to this paper. So I mentioned I just emailed all of these authors, and one of the authors, it was this big meta-analysis they had done, and part of their code I didn't quite understand, and I didn't understand where these numbers were coming from, and I didn't quite understand where what was written in the paper, where you could find that in the script. And so I just emailed them, and ended up being a really good discussion on like, oh, I just use this, series of code when I want this, sort of graph to display these error bars, or this kind of trend, but didn't realize that I hadn't explained that at all. All of a sudden, it was just like, it just hopped over to this seemingly random group of, lines of code, and it totally made sense to them as writing it, because they've used it before and they just adopted it in this new meta-analysis. And I think that's also really helpful for everybody to understand. And I think you have much more experience in this, but I think like within this open science community, it's like, if it's not just for the sake of complaining, like, I love critique because I think it really helps. It really helps to learn. And I think like within this kind of open science field, I've found at least that the people who I've been in communication with are much more open to this kind of form of building up this resource network, instead of there's not, I don't know if you could consider it like traditional pride, but it's quite I found it's been really helpful, I think. And maybe that helps as being like a young, or like just stepping into the field, as well as like I come from the perspective of I'm not sure, so I would love feedback. And I think that I'm going to use this as much as I can before I can be called absolutely a so-called expert.
And I love the advice of emailing the authors. Like, that's actually really, really good advice. Doesn't occur to me sometimes. And we should do that more. Like, we're here to talk to each other, right? That's what papers are, and that's what you would think. I don't know. I feel like that's what the community of scientists is. We're here to talk to each other, build off of each other, work together.
Yeah.
So let's talk to each other. Not that I particularly want a whole lot more emails, just in terms of workload, but I think that's the more fun emails, the more interesting things to get in your inbox.
Yeah, and I think, well, I guess when we're on this topic, and maybe it's a, I don't know if I can say generational, but I think it's also like maybe more emails are not more fun, but I think like lowering the threshold for, okay, well, I'm actually walking to work at this point, so if you have a question on my paper, we can just chat about it, on a phone call, or call me between this time and this time. And I know it's not always easy to say you're going to be open for virtual office hours, but I think it kind of makes you feel closer. had discussed is kind of when you've only seen somebody's name as an author on a paper and you meet them in real life speaking at a conference, and it's kind of mind-blowing. It's like when you're young and you see your teacher at the grocery store, it's like, what, do you exist outside of the realms of the classroom? Like, this is insane. So I think understanding that there are also people behind these scientific arguments as well is kind of fun to maybe email more and to get advice, because as people who have written papers ourselves, like, we have ideas and thoughts and words and conversations beyond just the paragraphs in our articles that we write, and so does everyone else then.
Exactly. Yeah, it'd be really nice to just in general lower that barrier to access to academia, right? To just generally invite more conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe we can, I don't know, be more explicit about having our inboxes open to that. Maybe it's something I can put on, like, I don't know, my social media or something.
Yeah.
To lower that barrier, because I think there's definitely an element of I don't know, but inferiority, is that the right word? Of like, ooh, should I like bother this person? They're like this really big famous person, and like, do they have time for me? And should I really email them? It's like, yeah, why not?
Oh yeah.
The worst that can happen is that you get nothing back. But like, I think in most cases, everyone that I've heard talk about this as like, actually, I love this kind of question. Like, please talk to me. I love talking about my work. And like, which one of us doesn't love to talk about our work?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a really awesome opportunity as well to, like you were saying, get to know somebody as well, and how they think and how they talk, and just learning from each other, I think can be really helpful. Like, you know, shout out to Twitter, like, feeling like ranting about Bayesian statistics, like, you know, DM and we can talk about it, you know, and then you end up having this more open conversation as well. And I think it can be helpful as well, or just asking when you have a question, I think, instead of waiting until it's the right time or you've got enough of a background to ask this question, I think. So yes, I got good at writing emails during the pandemic, asking questions, saying, I really don't know exactly how to ask this question, but I see in your script something that I don't understand. Could you please explain it to me? And I think that, I felt a bit foolish writing the email, but I got an answer. So I guess I feel validated in that.
I mean, I'm thinking if I got a question like that, it'd be like, someone read my work? Ooh. Someone's actually interested? Awesome.
You read page 27?
Of course I would want to engage with that person. It's such a nice, like, form of, I don't know, flattery in academia. I was like, ooh, wow. I don't know, because it feels like, I don't have that many papers out, but they're just like out in the void. I don't know who reads them or engages with them, so it feels like what I do has like no impact. But I don't know.
Yeah, and I think
no way of knowing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing that you say too. It is kind of maybe a topic for a different podcast. So like, how do you feel about work just floating there and you're not exactly sure about, you know, how it's being received and how you can look more about the reception of that. So I think, but yeah, I felt I had a really, if there's anything I can give advice to, it is to just email about that weird graph on page 27.
Yeah.
It's great. You get a lot of good conversation, and I think it's I think it can be really helpful as well.
Woo, so now we're proper full of new knowledge and awesome advice. Time to wash it down now with some tea and spill the tea. Nora, what do you want to rant about?
Yes. Well, I would love a cup of tea, but I also think that Bayesian statistics are awesome. And this is one thing that I really learned through my paper as well, is adopting Bayesian statistics. Thanks to an email from one of my advisors who had gone to a talk and said, hey, what's this Bayesian statistics thing? Maybe we can just apply it. And so I went through. So I quickly learned a lot of Bayesian statistics, and I'm by no means an expert, but I can, in addition to that paper I mentioned at the very beginning, I think I've sent a couple of resources to Sarah, can put in the show notes, but it's Wagenmakers has this great blog, and essentially Bayesian statistics is not what what he talks about is it's kind of Bayesian inference, or this Bayesian statistics is common sense expressed in numbers. And so we are looking at two, what he calls kind of rival accounts, and this is the H1 and the null. And what you're looking for with this learning cycle kind of within Bayesian statistics is you are doing deduction and induction. So you have like your prior knowledge about the world, and then you make a prediction from this. You're gathering the data and you're looking at kind of this, how that data lines up with your prediction. You adjust your new base of knowledge based on this. So say you've got kind of a clump of, you have where you thought your evidence would lie, and then you gather this data and you get this clump of evidence that's maybe a bit to the left if you're looking at a horizontal timeline or line. Then you kind of update where you expect new data to be if all of this prior data has come in. So it's this cyclical process where you're always updating. So kind of like what we're talking about, where you can't just add data until you get a significant number. This is kind of the reasoning behind that, is where you're just adding more data to give you more evidence, not necessarily towards one place. As I mentioned briefly before, my monodialectal participants, I ended up getting kind of anecdotal evidence for the null. So I actually ended up most of my participants having evidence to support the null than I expected. And that's just where they ended up. So the more participants I added, the closer to the null they got. So it doesn't actually lead you to prevalence here. But I think it's what's really, I really love about Bayesian statistics as well, is that you're constantly updating, but you're also looking at with this sequential Bayes, when you're constantly updating, a lot of the designs use a maximal n. So it's not a power analysis. It's, for example, in my paper, it's set to 60. I used it based on some previous papers that had set the maximal n to 60 as well, participants. And at this point, you've got quite a lot of evidence to either support or not support. But this is really helpful when, for example, in my study, I was testing 13-month-old participants, and this in a really strict time window, and it's you don't want to have to test more participants than you need to. And so this is really helpful when you are like, you've only got a certain amount. And actually, for the reverse, I only had to test 20 participants for my biodialectal infants. And you'd think, how can you test 20 participants and this is enough? Like, this would never be enough in a power analysis. But all this evidence was just so strongly pointing towards the Bayesian factor, and it was high above the inference criteria. And so you're also able to stop earlier, which is something that I think saves you time and resources, where if the evidence shows kind of, like if you, not necessarily in poking a pizza, but back to a pizza analogy, but it's kind of like if you say, cheese pizza, and you get a cheese pizza, and you order, you say this 3 times and it's correct every time. Like, are you going to order a 4th just because you need to be proven that you're going to get cheese when you say cheese? Like, you're, at some point you have enough to show that it's most likely going to be the case. And so, it's, I guess what Wagenmacher sometimes says, like, the level of surprise is kind of what is adjusting this. So like if it's kind of on par with what you're thinking, it's also gathering evidence to be within the same hypothesis where it is. So what I also think is really interesting is talking about, I guess I've mentioned this as well too, that you have the weight of a null hypothesis where there isn't significance or insignificance. It's just where the evidence lies. And I think that this can kind of help us to restructure what we're thinking about when we're thinking about, well, what are my results? It's not necessarily that they're significant or insignificant. You kind of see where the data points fall, essentially. And then this is where this is what you've got in the end, instead of looking if they are heading one way or another. I think this is really powerful as well. Yeah, so I don't know how to make Bayesian statistics more convincing, other than the fact that now there's Bayes packages on R, so you don't have to write the script yourself. My script will be up on the OSF page. So I think, and it's a Bayesian t-test. It's quite simple and elegant in terms of like R scripts. So yeah, Bayesian statistics, relative predictive performance. It's not frequentist.
No, what I understand also from it is that Bayesian allows you to make really specific predictions and then test all those specific predictions. Okay, look at this hypothesis. Does it match the data? How much? What's the Bayes factor for that? Let's try a different hypothesis. How does it match with the data? And so you can sort of look around and modify your prediction and just see how well it fits with your data. Which is something that is, like, again, a big unknown frequentist. You don't do that because multiple testing is a problem, right? That's just not a problem in Bayes. So, like, I'm super convinced. I was convinced years ago, honestly. And I've just not gotten around to implementing it. So this is giving me, like, an extra kick of, like, trying to do that again. To implement Bayesian stats in future work. I don't really have anything started up yet in this new job, but there will be. So I can think about... learning and then applying the implementation. I think I have a pretty good grasp on the theory of like why and how it works. And I'm totally convinced. For me, it was Understanding Psychology as a Science by Zoltan Dienes that like really cemented that for me, where I was like, this makes total sense. Cool, I'm on board.
Bayes, that's actually in my previous life I worked as a healthcare consultant, and we did we had some statisticians who used Bayesian statistics, and it was one of those things it made total sense, and I was so convinced, but I was just not ready to dive into that world. And then little did I know that this is where I would end up. So I think it's great. It's really interesting, and like you were saying too, is where it's not necessarily that you have this idea and then you get data and it's significant or it's not, but it's looking at like, well, what about this hypothesis? What about this model of, it's kind of like, what about this model of our understanding of the world? Okay, here's our data. How well does that fit with those two? So you're essentially like, those gel slides where you can cover lights to make different colors. It's kind of like, well, how well do these fit together? How much did this match up with what you were expecting about the world to see the world through, and how, so I think it's definitely much more statistics-y, I guess, if you can say this. But it kind of forces you to also get a better grasp and understanding about what statistics actually is as well, I feel. Because of this, you have to understand the model from which you are, applying the data to.
I find it a lot more intuitive. Because this idea of like, that hypothesis, how about this other worldview? How about this other worldview? Let's try this other model. Like, why couldn't you do that? Right? Like, it's just, it's unintuitive to say that, like, nope, you can only try one thing and that is it. Because that's the way that frequentist is set up. It's long-term probabilities. And because of the error rates within a family, like, you can't. But that seems like the intuitive thing to do in everyday life. You have this evidence and you go, okay, does this explain it? No. Okay, let's try this other thing. Like, Bayesian's just so much more intuitive. It makes so much more sense.
Yes, exactly. So I definitely suggest checking out the Bayesian Spectacles blog. I'm a big fan. So I think it's really, really something that I'm ranting about in the best way. Try Bayes.
All right, so you heard it from us, listeners. Reproducibility. I hope we've convinced you. Everyone should be doing Bayesian stats. Go.
Yes. Exactly.
All right, that was a delicious spot of tea. So let's balance out this whole meal with some delectable desserts. What I wanted to bring this week was something that I learned at a SIPS conference. It was last year, so SIPS 2022. I had to think about that for a second.
It's already last year.
Time is confusing. In Victoria, I learned that you can appeal rejections from journals and from conferences. It never occurred to me that you can appeal something like that. To me, rejection was always just like, oh, well, that's it. They said no. But it blew my mind. And I actually have used it for the first time recently.
Nice.
A paper was rejected from a conference, and some of the feedback was just, it wasn't generous. Like it was a bad faith reading of our paper. And so we wrote to the conference organizers and we appealed on that basis. We said, like, look, we think that this is in bad faith. This is only an abstract. What you're extrapolating isn't founded, or what the reviewer is extrapolating isn't founded. And this is excluding a critical view, because it was like talking about ideology, which can be scary. When you're challenging the status quo, sometimes, you tend to get shut out. On the basis of exclusion as well. And they accepted the appeal, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So we now get to present this work.
Oh, congrats.
So we're really glad that the organizers were accepting of this appeal and, heard our argument and actually responded in a positive way.
Yeah.
And from what I hear, when you also appeal to journal editors, rejections and things, you have a good chance of the decision being reversed. So it's worth a try.
That's a huge, I feel like that is a untapped piece of, knowledge out there. That's just like you were saying when it blew your mind, where it's, when you hear no, it's kind of like, all right, well, I guess I gave it a shot, but I think what you were explaining too is that when you are sending an appeal, it also helps you to kind of revise, well, I think my work is important, and, like sharing your work. And especially I think when you have something like ideology and challenging the status quo, it's like, well, that's exactly the opportunity where it needs to be shared to more than when you were saying, you send out a paper into the void. These are the types of papers that are challenging and important. And I think that when you're appealing rejections, I think, we can all learn from you and be a little bit more bold in saying, well, maybe, if it's a no, because it might be. And like you were saying, and it's having a bad faith reading, and everybody can experience that from both sides as well. And I think it's good for us to know, and remember that we can appeal it, especially if it's something we are passionate about wanting to share. And also for reviewers, and understanding that, like, oh yeah, maybe I didn't think about this or consider this point from an author when I was reviewing this as well. So I think, that's a good slice of cake right there.
Yeah, that was a great learning for me. I think it just occurred to me about funding. I don't think you could appeal a funding decision. I think that one's a little bit harder.
Give more money.
I don't know if anyone's tried. But I suspect that would be a lot more difficult. Whereas journals or conferences, it's often colleagues. It's a bit more collegial, just in general, I think. You feel like have we covered everything? Anything else that you want to raise?
No, I guess if our final sum up, I would say that registered reports are time intensive and they are lengthy, and so I think, like, also respecting that it will take a lot of time too, because I think for example, your master's students who maybe only have a year, and having it be a flop, like having the experience of writing a flop is also not amazing either. So I think that there are a lot more motivated younger people out there as well, and like being given this opportunity, I think, was really a motivator for me to also continue. And going into, like, I feel more prepared starting a PhD, and also considering like what steps I have to do when I'm thinking about an outline for my next 3-4 years will this be a part of it? Like, taking time to post all my at least pre-registrations is something where I'm planning on doing, and I think that this is really helpful just for like a mindset moving forward as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on to our podcast and sharing your experience. I think we're going to take a lot from what you've shared, lots of great advice in there as well. If anyone wants to follow you more, where can they find you online?
Ooh, I am more of a follower than a tweeter on Twitter,
Sure.
but I'm just at Nora Serres, and on Instagram as well, at Nora Serres. There you can see more about my, in my quote unquote free time, I compete in ultra trail running and have chickens. So if you are interested in that, maybe I'll do some like Bayesian statistics on color of eggs. We'll see. But yeah, so if you are looking at some mountain inspired academia, then head over to my Instagram. And if you're looking into more straight science, then I would go for Twitter. But both at Nora Serres.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yes.
So you can follow Reproducibility on Twitter at ReproducibiliTea. If you want to follow me, I'm at Sarah_Sauve, or at Madame YYT, MADOMYYT on TikTok, where I'm talking about my day-to-day life at work. That wraps our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much, Nora, for coming on.
Yes.
See you next time.
Bye. Thanks, Sarah, for hosting a good platform.